וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור, צב אס אהרון ויס בניו לאמור, זוס תורס העולה, היא העולה על מוקדה על המזבח כל הלילה עד הבוקר, באש המזבח תוקד בו.
Our parasha is called Tzav. It is a continuation of the instructions that God gives to Moses from the tent of meeting. And it starts in Leviticus chapter 6, verse 8. When the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command Tzav, Aaron and his sons. The two parashot are connected. The previous one gave the instruction to the one who offers the sacrifice, while the second parasha gives the instruction to the priests concerning the burnt offerings, cereal offerings, guilt offerings, sin offerings, and peace offerings. With regards to the burnt offerings, the priests are really, the priests are supposed to keep the fire upon the altar burning. The same fashion as in the book of Exodus, they are commanded to keep the menorah lit all the time. The same way, the fire upon the altar of the burning of the burnt offering cannot be extinguished, and the burnt offering serves as the foundation for the other offerings. Upon that fire of the burnt offerings is supposed to actually burn the fat of the sin offerings and the peace offerings. It is interesting how the chapter is dealing with the fat issues, because the only meat which is actually being burned upon the altar is the meat of the burnt offering. And it is supposed to stay, according to Leviticus 6, until the morning, until it completely burned down. And then the new sacrifice comes in, the daily sacrifice, and therefore the ashes from the old sacrifice have to be removed, and for this reason priest changes the garment from the nice wool and ephod and all of this, and he puts the linen garment, and he does really a dirty work. So it is, on the one hand, it is an honor to be the priest, but on the other hand, it has to be, the priest had to do daily that dirty work by removing the remains of the carcass of the entire offerings, which is burned down during the night or during the entire day. The rest of the sacrifices, their meat, are not burned upon the altar. Only the fat is burnt upon the altar. And this is interesting how Leviticus chapter 7 deals with that. Because peace offerings are to, and the sin offerings, you have to bring the fat upon the altar. And of course, the peace offering, the meat is eaten by those who bring this offering. But they are not supposed to take a fat. In fact, the tastes in the ancient Near East and even in today's Near Eastern people is more toward the fat, particularly the fat which is under the tail of the ram or the fat which is inside upon the internal organs, that fat is considered to be the most delicious portion of the animal. Well, as the modern medicine knows today, this is the worst part of the flesh, and it creates creating a cholesterol. And of course, God is not talking in the medical terms, but He says to the people of Israel, give me the best. You love this fat from the animal, but you want to glorify me, so give me that best part which you want to eat. I am the Lord, glorify me. But in reality, Lord knows that that best part is actually worst for the people to eat, and that's why it works both ways. It is interesting how the Leviticus chapter 7 talks about the peace offering. No one who has any uncleanness, and no one who has ever touched a dead carcass or even had a funeral is not allowed to eat from the peace offerings. Why is this so? Later in other parashot, we will learn the issue of the ritual uncleanness. And it will be actually represented in the parasha Tazria and Mitzorah, which are the next ones. But now the issue of ritual uncleanness is introduced in connection with the ability of the individual to be at the temple and to eat from the peace offerings. And the prohibition is very strong. If anyone who came into contact with anything unclean will attempt to eat the peace offering, this person will be cut off from the people of Israel. The real issue of the touching is very important in the book in the Levitical law. Particular talking about the priestly obligation with regards to sin offerings. Verse 27, chapter 6. Anyone who touches its flesh will become consecrated, and any of its blood splashes on a garment in a holy place, you shall wash what was splashed on. We see the issue of the flesh of the offering and the blood of the offering that have a specific role. This idea has its origins from the previous Torah portion, when the issue of Kippur Al was raised. And we talk about Kippur Al as ability to take away something, to bear away the sins, according to Leviticus 10, chapter 17. How does the priest, which it says here in Leviticus 4, verse 31, is actually able to bear off the sins of the people? Leviticus 6 explains it. What does exactly the priest do in making the atonement? It says, speak to Aaron, verse 25, and to his sons, saying, this is the law of the sin offering. In the place where the burnt offering is slain, the sin offering shall be slain before the Lord. It is most holy. The most holy is very important definition here. The meat or the flesh of the sin offering is most holy, or in Hebrew, Kodesh Kodashim, as well as the most holy place or inner sanctum of the sanctuary, as well as the tithe. That's why there is such an attention to this. Verse 26 says, what is to be done with this most holy? The priest who offers it, the priest who offers it for sin shall eat it. It shall be eaten in the holy place, in the court of the tent of meeting. This is what happens basically. The sins, the priest, as we read in Leviticus 10:17, bears off the sin from the individual, and now it's the flesh of that sin offering in the courtyard of the sanctuary. In fact, this is not such a pleasant thing. Leviticus chapter 8 describes to us how Moses actually trains the priest to do this. That's the conclusion of our parasha, because the same manner, first the instruction is given to Moses how to build the sanctuary, then the actual building is executed, and in the same way as the priest the Moses receives the instructions for the priest, now in chapter 8 he starts actually hands-on training of the priest. And at the end of this hands-on training, Moses says to Aaron, when they already learned how to perform that sacrifice, first they did it for themselves, now they are ready to perform it for other people. And Moses says to Aaron, verse 31, boil the flesh at the doorway of the tent of meeting, and eat it there together with the bread which is in a basket of the ordination offering, just as I commanded, saying, Aaron and his son shall eat it. So what is happening here, that meat is really not delicious. To boil something in the water, especially the lamb and the goat, even the beef, without any spices and without any salt, and it wasn't a really pleasant, tasty experience. This is why in the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, when Eli the high priest has problems with his sons, who actually did not like the fact that the sin offerings were just being boiled, and they didn't like eat this cooked meat, and they would pull it out and put it under the fire to fry. And God is saying this is an iniquity. The reason is very simple. Sin is not a pleasant thing to bear. And the priest here symbolically bears the sins of the people in the same way as it's been prophesied in the Psalm. There will be a priest under the order of Melchizedek who is able to bear all these sins of the people. And in the epistles of Hebrews, which was read before as a complement to the previous parashot. We read about the perfect high priest in heaven. But here we have this experience of Aaron in a symbolic way when they have to actually carry those sins and they have to experience the unpleasantness of those. And that's why they eat it in that manner. And we have an interesting chain here. We have a chain of a sin transfer in the sanctuary, and that is exactly the reason why, in addition to the altar, which was used in the time of patriarchs, the sanctuary was built. Because the sanctuary illustrates the chain of event that happened when a person comes to the Lord and wants to be relieved from his sins. First of all, he unloads his sins upon the head of the animal, and that animal takes the responsibility and dies. But then the priest comes and he does two things. First of all, he makes the manipulation with the blood. And the blood is also an agent of a sin transfer. Hear what it says in the book of Leviticus, chapter 17, verse 11. For a life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls, and for it is the blood by the reason of life that makes an atonement. Again, we talk about the atonement as a kiper al, as the verb that indicates the ability to carry out something, to unload something. And in fact, that is the meaning of kiper al, how it's understood even today in the Orthodox Jewish circle, ultra-Orthodox Hasidic circle, because today at the Yom Kippur, the Hasidim, they take the rooster. They understand, of course, no Jews today are even making any attempt to sacrifice animals, because it's a prerogative of the temple. But the Hasidim have this ritual. They have this rooster. They call it a kapara. And they take this rooster, the father of the house, and they whirl this rooster above their heads, and they say a specific prayer. May my sins be transferred onto this rooster, and rooster will carry them away. This is the idea of sin transfer that is rooted deeply in the Levitical law. That's why the blood is spilled upon the base of the altar, and the meat is also used as an agent of sin transfer, and it is consumed by the priests, and the priest basically carry these sins upon the great day, which is called Yom HaKippurim, and during that day these sins are removed. Because the sin offerings, they actually consist of two parts. The individual sins that are actually carried by the priests, and the collective sins, the sins of the assembly, or the sins of the priests themselves. These sins cannot be dealt by the priest. Priest is human and is not able to carry, to bear away this iniquity. He is not set up to do this. And to take care of this problem, the bull is sacrificed, and the blood of the bull, and we know the blood is used to bear away the sins, is taken up to the curtain, the veil which separates the kaforet, the paroket in Hebrew, that separates between the holy and the most holy. And right in front of that paroket, there is the altar of the golden incense altar, and that is where the blood is applied. So we see clearly on that example how the sins are carried into the sanctuary. Anything which has the sin, the only way to get rid of it, the only way to make a kiper al from it, is to actually give it away into the sanctuary. And there is a reason for it, which will be discussed in the Parasha Achrei Mot. But the dynamic is clear. From the human being, the sin is transferred into the sanctuary. And that's how the sanctuary functions. It consists of two opposite flows. From the people of Israel toward the sanctuary, there is a flow of sin and uncleanness, while from the sanctuary toward the people, there is a flow of cleanliness and forgiveness. These are the two opposite flows, and that's what makes sanctuary go. That's what makes this symbolic chain of events. And the symbolic nature of this is emphasized. Again and again, rabbis, when they talk about the issue of the offerings, they are always puzzled with their meanings. Because, of course, in Rabbinic Judaism, the function of the substitutionary sacrifice is denied, even though some remnants of these traditions are preserved, like in this Hasidic kapara ritual, but the majority of the Orthodox and Reform and Conservative Jews deny any substitutionary aspect of the sacrifice. And because of this, this denial comes from the early rabbinic writings. For example, Rabbi Meir, that grapples with the issue of how do we actually keep these commandments, right from the destruction of the temple. This was a big, big problem because 613 commandments, most of them were connected with temple. And Rabbi Meir comes into conclusion, talking about the parasha Tzav, reading actually verse 9, saying, this is the law for the burnt offering, English Bible, but in Hebrew it says, Zod ha'olah, Zod ha'torah shel olah. This is the Torah of the burnt offering. And Rabbi Meir makes this conclusion. It is our duty, even though we cannot perform these sacrifices, but it is our obligation to study those sacrifices. And that was the reason why in the Babylonian Talmud, even though the temple was non-existent for 300 years, the tractates dealing with sacrifices, the Seder Kodashim, is discussed and has Gemara to it, because rabbis continued studying the sacrifices, although there is a dichotomy here. At one point, their study of the, for example, Zvachim, which deals with the section of Parasha Tzav and Parasha Vayikra. This Zvachim are the sacrifices. They are dealing with nitty-gritty details, discussing especially some issues that existed in the time of Herod's temple. But at the same time, the Haftarah, which is selected to match this Parashat Tzav that deals with those details, emphasizes the opposite. In Jeremiah chapter 7, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, add your burnt offerings to your sacrifices and eat flesh. This is something which was discussed in a parasha, the meaning of eating the flesh. But then he says, for I did not speak to your fathers or command them in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning the burnt offerings and sacrifice. But this is what I commanded them, saying, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you will be my people, and you will walk all the way which I command you, and that it may be well with you. This is interesting that rabbis choose Jeremiah chapter 7 as Haftarah and emphasize the idea that the original God's intent for people was not to be saved through these manipulations and details, but was to actually obey the voice of the Lord. And again, this parallels to Isaiah, Haftarah to the previous parasha, where it's clear that these sacrifices were given as a visual aid to demonstrate the character and the intent of the Lord. But nevertheless, all these actions, there is a tension between the symbolic nature of this action and their theological meaning. And it's very clear that the idea of all these nitty-gritty ordinances which are given to the priest with regards to eating of the flesh is to emphasize the key element of the soteriology, the idea of sin transfer, the idea that the sin doesn't disappear on its own. The act of forgiveness is not equivalent to the idea of forgetting about somebody's misdeeds, but it lies the idea that somebody has to take the responsibility. And this responsibility is not limited to the death of the animal. The priest takes the responsibility and he carries this sin into the sanctuary, where the sanctuary assumes the responsibility. This shows the harmony which exists in God's plan. Because the common mistakes for many Christians is to believe that Jesus, as a good God, pleads with his Father, who is angry and wants to destroy the sinner. And only the plea of Jesus divert the anger of God against us. This is not correct. The heavenly sanctuary assumes the responsibility and absorbs our sins. And as the Hebrews, which we studied before, discusses that Jesus takes his blood and has to go up to the sanctuary in the same way as a priest does, transfer the sins of the world into the heavenly sanctuary. And for our study this week, we suggest the story of resurrection of Jesus as it is recorded in the book of John, chapter 20. And in this book, in this story, we have Mary who comes to Jesus, and she's happy to see him raised. And Jesus responds to her in verse 17, "Stop clinging to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to brethren and say to them, I ascend to my Father and your Father, and my God and your God." In other words, Jesus prevents Mary even to touch him when he just got out from the grave, because the idea of anyone touching the flesh of the sin offering is played out here. Before he is able to transfer the sins of the world unto the heavenly sanctuary, he is not allowed to be touched in the same way as the meat of the sin offering. And that's a beautiful illustration of correlation of the fact that whatever Jesus does happens according to the Levitical law, and there is no superstition or anything like this with Jesus' prohibition to Mary to touch him. But the idea of the necessity for everyone to unload and to transfer the sin is essential for the understanding of our salvation from our problems.